Among the brittle shelves of the Maritime Historical Society of Boston lies a cabinet seldom opened by visitors. Its drawers hold a collection of daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and albumen prints rescued from decaying attics and forgotten estates along the New England coast. Most are faded beyond recognition, faces melted into pale ghosts, seascapes reduced to vague mist. In the bottom drawer of that cabinet rests one image that archivists refer to, without any official title, as the photograph without a name. It measures roughly 4 by 6 inches, mounted on a cracked card bordered in black. The surface of the print shimmers with that peculiar silver sheen of 19th-century photography, a kind of half-life trapped beneath glass. The image itself is simple at first glance. A young boy sits in an ornate oak chair whose carved arms curl like waves frozen mid-motion. He appears to be around 6 or 7 years old, slim, pale, and dressed in a dark sailor's uniform that seems slightly too large for him. His small boots rest side by side, polished but scuffed at the toes, as if he had walked a long distance before the photograph was taken. In his hands he holds a delicate oval locket. The locket is open, revealing 2 tiny portraits, one of a man, the other of a woman. Both are stern, unsmiling, their faces captured with the rigid formality common to the era. The boy's thumbs press lightly on the metal frame, as though he fears the locket might close of its own accord. What unsettles those who study the image is the boy's expression. His eyes are wide, alert, fixed not on the camera but slightly beyond it, as if watching something behind the lens, or someone. There is no trace of the vacant calm typical of children in postmortem photographs. Instead, there is awareness, even intelligence, in his gaze. It feels as though he knows what is being done. The background of the photograph is indistinct. At first it seems to be a painted studio backdrop, a common choice in the 1870s, but closer examination reveals the faint outline of a window, a piece of furniture, perhaps the edge of a curtain caught midsway. The floor beneath the chair is uneven, wooden rather than tiled. Dust motes are visible in the air, frozen in the brief flash of daylight that must have seeped through a window pane when the shutter was opened. There are no studio markings on the card. No embossed name, no city, no photographer's seal. This absence is rare. Most professionals of the era signed their work proudly, both for reputation and for payment. Whoever captured this image either chose anonymity, or was instructed to remain so. Pinned beside the photograph in the archive is a small envelope, yellowed and sealed with brittle wax. Inside is a note written in fading ink. Found among the effects of a deceased widow in Camden, Maine. No identification. Believed to depict a child lost at sea, 1873. The handwriting is elegant, the sort taught in 19th-century academies. Yet the phrasing, believed to depict, betrays uncertainty. No record of any child matching that description was ever linked to the town of Camden in that year. Census data from 1870 and 1880 show no families resembling the one implied by the photograph. Over time, the image gathered its own mythology. Some curators claimed the boy was a sailor's son whose parents perished in a storm, leaving him orphaned and later dead of fever. Others insisted he was already deceased in the photograph, posed by grieving parents in the peculiar Victorian ritual of death photography. A few, those with a taste for the uncanny, suggested something darker, that the photograph was not a memorial, but a fabrication, a piece of evidence forged for reasons lost to history. Every decade or so, a researcher rediscovers the image and attempts to trace its origin. Each effort ends the same way, in silence. The coastal directories contain no Whitby Harbor, the supposed location noted faintly on the photograph's original envelope. No photographer named Reed, Cooper, or Allen, names sometimes speculated, appears in the records for 1873. And yet, despite this obscurity, the image endures. Visitors who encounter it often pause longer than they intend to, caught by the strange vitality in the boy's eyes. A few report the uneasy sensation that his expression changes with each viewing. Sometimes solemn, sometimes questioning, occasionally, it seems, almost pleading. When the archivists close the cabinet for the evening, the lamplight fades across the glass, and the boy's reflection vanishes with it. But in the silence that follows, one might imagine the faint echo of a shutter closing, a sound that, though made a century and a half ago, still seems to resonate in the dim corridors of history. It is said that photographs capture more than light. Some believe they hold fragments of what stood before the lens, a gesture, a thought, perhaps even a secret. If that is true, then this nameless portrait, this quiet, accusing image of a child who may never have existed, carries a secret that time has failed to erase. By the early 1870s, the photograph had become a household relic, a keepsake that promised memory could be tamed by light. Cameras, once the domain of scientists and aristocrats, had entered the parlors of the middle class. Photographic studios multiplied across cities and towns, their windows filled with images of stiffly posed families, soldiers in uniform, and infants in christening gowns. Among these new domestic rituals emerged one both intimate and unsettling, the postmortem portrait. It was a practice born not from morbidity but from longing. In an era when illness struck without warning and childhood mortality hovered cruelly high, death was a frequent visitor, and grief required ritual to be endured. When a loved one, especially a child, died, families would summon a photographer, sometimes traveling for miles, to capture a final likeness. The resulting image was not meant for horror but for comfort. Parents, unable to afford a painted portrait while the child lived, found solace in the permanence of the photograph. "He shall not fade," one grieving mother wrote in an 1871 diary, "for the glass will remember what my heart cannot." The process demanded both artistry and discretion. Photographers like Jonathan Reed, Isaac Bowers, and Samuel R. Hills carried not only cameras and chemicals but the gentleness of undertakers. They adjusted the bodies with tenderness, propping them upright with hidden stands, painting faint color onto pale cheeks, even inserting glass eyes to restore the illusion of wakefulness. Curtains were drawn to control the light, siblings were told to smile softly so that death might resemble sleep. Most of these portraits were serene, even beautiful. Infants lay in cradles surrounded by flowers, as though still dreaming. Mothers clasped their children one last time, eyes blurred with the long exposure. Fathers stood beside them, motionless pillars of restraint. These photographs became heirlooms, passed down through generations, a way of saying we loved and we lost and still we remember. Yet the photograph found in the archives of Whitby Harbor, if that place indeed existed, did not fit within this ritual of farewell. It carried none of the softness of mourning. There was no trace of tenderness in the arrangement, no flowers, no folded hands, no veil of grief. The boy's pose was deliberate, his fingers tense around the locket, his gaze too direct, too conscious. The most troubling detail was the composition itself. In typical postmortem portraits, the deceased were placed lying down or seated in positions suggesting sleep. The photographer would minimize the signs of death, the pallor of the skin, the stiffness of limbs. But in the Whitby photograph, the boy is upright, rigid, with the precision of an adult sitter. His chin is lifted, his shoulders square, his posture almost rehearsed. It is not the arrangement of a mourning parent but of a presentation. Historians who later studied the image noted the peculiar professionalism of its lighting. The shadow falls not behind him, as in most natural light photographs, but at a slight angle, suggesting the use of a reflector board, a tool employed by only the most skilled practitioners of the era. This, combined with the absence of a studio mark, raised troubling questions. Was the photograph taken by a professional acting in secrecy, or by someone who wished to remain unassociated with the act? Even in its time, the practice of photographing the dead was walking the narrow edge between reverence and taboo. While most towns tolerated it as a private expression of grief, others began to condemn it as morbid or indecent. Clergymen preached that such images invited the spirit's unrest. Newspapers mocked families who posed their dead like dolls. By 1873, the custom was already waning in urban centers, replaced by the sterner modernity of medical death certificates and clinical mourning. If the boy in the photograph was indeed deceased, his portrait represented one of the last gasps of that Victorian tradition. But if he was alive, if the life in his eyes was genuine, then the image became something else entirely, not remembrance but deception. A photograph designed not to soothe loss, but to invent a story. That possibility lingered in every detail: the unnatural stillness, the deliberate placement of the locket, the lack of identifiable setting. To some scholars, it suggested that the photograph's purpose extended beyond sentimentality. It might have served as proof, a document meant to establish lineage, legitimacy, or inheritance. For every grieving mother who begged for her child's likeness to be preserved, there were others who understood the power of the photograph as testimony. In courtrooms and insurance offices, a single image could determine the fate of property, wealth, even social standing. To produce a convincing likeness was to create truth itself. And so the boundaries between remembrance and fabrication began to blur. A photograph could capture love or forge it. It could preserve death or disguise it. Somewhere in that uncertainty, in the dim light of a makeshift studio by the sea, a man once raised his camera and opened the shutter on a moment that was never meant to be witnessed. The silver plate fixed the boy's image forever, but the truth of that image, whether it recorded life or something colder, remains beyond reach. To look upon that photograph now is to confront a silence deeper than grief, the silence of manipulation, the quiet power of a picture that might not mourn the dead, but create them. The first mention of the boy who may have sat for the Whitby Harbor photograph appears in a small, nearly forgotten newspaper, the Maine Gazette, dated June 21, 1873. The notice occupied no more than 3 lines on the 3rd page, between advertisements for patent medicine and a shipping forecast. Missing, a child of about 7 years, Henry Alden, son of English settlers residing near the wharf, last seen at dusk on Tuesday. Any information leading to his recovery will be compensated. No engraving, no description beyond the child's name and approximate age. In a summer filled with maritime accidents and cholera scares, such notices came and went without ceremony. Children vanished, swept away by the sea, lost in forests, claimed by sickness before doctors could arrive. But something about this particular case lingered longer than most. A week later, a second, shorter notice appeared. The matter of the missing Alden boy has been resolved to the satisfaction of the family. The public's concern is appreciated. Further inquiry is unnecessary. Then nothing more. No recovery, no burial, no statement of gratitude. The phrase, resolved to the satisfaction of the family, was unusual, bureaucratic, evasive, and coldly final. Archivists later found that the Aldens were recent arrivals from England, having emigrated 2 years prior aboard a vessel registered to the Cartwright Trading Company. Passenger manifests from 1871 list a Thomas and Margaret Alden, ages 34 and 28, traveling with one child, Henry, age 5. The ship's destination was Boston, but no subsequent census entry lists their names. It is as though the family existed only long enough to be recorded once. From scattered references in church and shipping records, historians pieced together a faint outline. The Aldens rented a small house near the docks of a fishing town called Whitby Harbor, a settlement that, curiously, no longer appears on any modern map. It may have been a cluster of wharves and cottages along the Maine coast, later absorbed or abandoned as trade routes shifted. The only surviving mention comes from an 1873 shipping ledger referencing Whitby Harbor Storehouse No. 4. After that year, the name disappears entirely. The town's obscurity complicates the mystery. No parish registers survived, and the county archives were partially destroyed in a fire in 1881. Yet letters from a local customs officer, preserved by his descendants, contain a passing remark that has drawn the attention of researchers for decades. There is unease among the townsfolk about the English woman who claims her boy was taken by the tide. Some whisper she is not his mother at all. The husband is seldom seen, and there are strange visitors at their house after dark. The customs officer's letter was dated June 23, 1873, the same week the second newspaper notice was printed. If Margaret Alden was indeed not the boy's mother, then who was she? And why would an entire family vanish within days of his disappearance? Rumors persisted that the Aldens fled by sea shortly after the incident. A schooner named the Arabella reportedly departed from Camden bound for Liverpool on June 28. its passenger list conveniently incomplete. Among the recorded names is one Arden, a variation that may or may not be significant. No Thomas Alden appears, though crew rosters note an unnamed paying passenger occupying the captain's quarters, a privilege rare for ordinary travelers. What became of the boy was never confirmed. Some believed he had drowned and been quietly buried on the shore. Others suggested he had been taken, either adopted or sold, a grim speculation not uncommon in the port cities of that era, where orphans and foundlings often vanished into the anonymity of labor or servitude. But the strangest aspect of all emerged decades later, when the photograph resurfaced. The boy's features, his dark hair, his solemn expression, the faint scar near his temple, matched perfectly the age Henry Alden would have been at the time of his disappearance. And in his hands, that small locket containing 2 portraits bore a resemblance to the images found on a marriage certificate belonging to Thomas and Margaret Alden. If the photograph was indeed taken after the boy's disappearance, it could only mean one of 2 things. Either the Aldens staged the image to memorialize a lost child, or someone else staged it for them, to construct a narrative that served a hidden purpose. One theory, advanced by historian Eleanor Marsh in 1938, proposes that the photograph was commissioned not as a keepsake but as evidence, a piece of visual proof required for a legal or financial claim. At that time, photographs were increasingly accepted in courts as verification of identity. If a wealthy relative in England required an heir, or if a disputed inheritance depended on proof of a child's existence, such an image could serve as binding testimony. But why would the image bear no signature? Why would the supposed photographer hide his name? Perhaps because he knew what he had created was not truth, but performance. A tableau meant to convince, not commemorate. And what of the town, Whitby Harbor, erased so neatly from maps and memory? Was it merely coincidence, or deliberate omission? A ghost port for a ghost child. The silence that surrounds the Aldens' disappearance remains nearly complete. All that endures is the photograph, a single, unmarked window into a vanished life. It sits in the archive, labeled only Unknown Boy, 1873, as though that were all the story ever needed. But those who look into the boy's unwavering eyes find it difficult to believe that a life could disappear so neatly, so quietly, without a trace of struggle. Something in his expression seems to resist oblivion, as though he remembers everything that others chose to forget. If one name can be linked to the mysterious photograph of the Whitby Harbor boy, it is that of Jonathan Reed, an itinerant photographer whose life traced the shifting boundaries between artistry, commerce, and secrecy. Reed's surviving records, scattered across ledgers, receipts, and fragments of correspondence, paint the picture of a man both skilled and haunted. Born in Providence, Rhode Island, in 1839, he apprenticed under a daguerreotypist before the Civil War. He served briefly as a field photographer for the Union Army, capturing grim landscapes of battlefields after the fighting had ceased. Those who later examined his wartime prints noted an unusual sensitivity in his compositions. He seemed less interested in soldiers than in absence. The silent earth after violence had passed. After the war, Reed became one of hundreds of traveling photographers roaming New England, offering portraits, tintypes, and memorial likenesses. By 1870, he was advertising his services in local gazettes under the modest slogan, Jonathan Reed, artist of shadows and remembrance, portraits taken in life or after. To modern ears, the phrase may sound morbid, but in its time it was a professional declaration. Death photography was a practical necessity, and Reed's reputation rested on his ability to produce images that comforted rather than horrified. He was known for patience, discretion, and an almost priest-like calm with bereaved families. But among his ledgers, preserved through luck by a distant cousin, one entry has drawn particular attention from historians. Dated June 18, 1873, it reads, Commission of special nature. Child subject. Payment received in gold. Client anonymous. The words are written in Reed's careful, slanted hand. Below them, faintly penciled, appears an unsettling addendum. Required preparation beyond ordinary limits. Those 6 words have fueled speculation for more than a century. In the terminology of 19th-century photographers, preparation referred to the cosmetic and physical adjustments made to the body of a deceased subject before exposure. To exceed ordinary limits implied something unusual, perhaps damage to the body that required concealment, or, more disturbingly, a deliberate alteration of its appearance. No client's name accompanies the entry. In his otherwise meticulous ledger, this omission stands alone. For every other commission, Reed noted at least a surname, a town, or a fee schedule. Here, only the cryptic line remains, as if he wished to forget what the entry recorded. Shortly after this date, Reed's professional trail goes silent for nearly 2 months. There are no receipts, no orders for photographic plates, no correspondence. When his records resume in late August of 1873, he is listed as working again in Providence, advertising cartes de visite and family portraits, daylight guaranteed. What transpired in those missing weeks is unknown. But in one of his personal notebooks, now kept at the Rhode Island Historical Society, he left a fragment of a letter never sent. I have done as they asked. The child was gone long before I took the plate. They required that he seem alive, that his eyes should be open. I pray that the sea forgets. The handwriting has been authenticated as Reed's. There is no indication of who they were. By the 1880s, Reed's career declined. Advances in photographic technology rendered itinerant portraitists obsolete, and younger men with cheaper equipment replaced him. He took work restoring damaged photographs and coloring prints for others. Friends described him as quiet, prematurely gray, given to staring at his own negatives as though listening for a voice. In 1895, he died in his workshop, surrounded by boxes of glass plates. Among them was a single envelope marked in trembling script, "Do not exhibit. This image should never have been made." Inside, the archivist later found nothing but a cracked glass negative too degraded to recover. But the fragment of the label bore one legible word, Harbor. That alone has tied Reed irrevocably to the mysterious image of the boy. Some have defended him, arguing that he was merely a craftsman fulfilling a commission, an artisan caught in the moral ambiguities of his trade. Others suggest he was complicit in a deception, perhaps even blackmail, using his skills to forge visual proof for those with something to gain. Whatever the truth, Reed's surviving photographs reveal a man obsessed with the border between life and death. Many depict subjects whose stillness feels deliberate, as if life were something he tried to reassemble from fragments of shadow and light. His compositions linger at that uneasy threshold where the living appear embalmed and the dead seem almost awake. It is tempting to see the Whitby Harbor photograph as the culmination of that obsession, the image in which Reed finally crossed a line he could not uncross. The blurred background, the unnatural clarity of the eyes, the precise symmetry of the child's hands, each detail suggests calculation, not accident. Perhaps Reed believed he was preserving a family's peace. Or perhaps he understood, even as the shutter closed, that he was helping to fabricate a falsehood so convincing that it would outlive every participant. If the boy in the photograph was truly Henry Alden, then Reed became the silent witness to a crime committed not with violence, but with art. And if the boy was not Henry at all, if he was some other child, dressed and arranged to impersonate the missing heir, then Reed's image is not a memorial, but an invention, a lie fixed forever in silver nitrate. Either way, the photograph marked the end of Reed's career and the beginning of his legend. Today, his name survives only in footnotes, his reputation clouded by a single act that history cannot fully confirm or deny. But when archivists study his surviving negatives under the glow of restoration lamps, they often remark that one image among them, the blurred outline of a child's face, half faded, half emerging, seems to watch them from the glass. And perhaps that is Jonathan Reed's truest legacy, not the hundreds of portraits he took in life, but the one image he wished the world would forget. By autumn of 1873, the name Alden had all but vanished from local Maine records. But that same year, another name began to appear in the legal notices of Boston and London society columns. Cartwright, a name associated with old maritime fortunes, colonial ventures, and the slow decay of English nobility. The Cartwright Trading Company, established in 1821, had built its wealth on transatlantic commerce, timber, textiles, and later, whaling. Its patriarch, Sir Edmund Cartwright, had died the previous year, leaving no officially recognized male heir. His estate, vast and sprawling, included warehouses in Liverpool, merchant ships, and extensive property holdings in Cornwall and New England. Without a legitimate successor, the estate became the subject of quiet but fierce litigation among distant cousins and business partners. The case might have remained confined to English courts had not, in late 1873, a woman arrived from America bearing proof of blood. Her name was Margaret Alden, formerly Margaret Cartwright, she claimed, the estranged daughter of Sir Edmund, long thought dead or disowned. Her documentation was impeccable, baptismal papers, letters, even a marriage certificate linking her to a merchant named Thomas Alden. But what settled the matter, according to surviving court transcripts, was a photograph she produced before the legal counsel of Cartwright and Sons. It was said to depict her late son, Henry Cartwright Alden, the rightful descendant of the Cartwright line. The court records describe the image only briefly: a boy of about 7 years, seated and holding a locket containing 2 portraits, one of a man and one of a woman. The photograph was accepted as evidence, not for the boy's identity alone, but as visible confirmation of Margaret's own story. She testified that her child had perished tragically on the American coast, but that she brought his likeness as proof of her connection to her father's name. In the rigid formality of Victorian inheritance law, appearances often mattered as much as truth. The image of the child, bearing recognizable Cartwright features, the dark eyes, the narrow chin, was sufficient to persuade the trustees that the bloodline continued through her even if her son had died. By December of that year, the dispute was settled privately. Margaret received a modest but respectable portion of the estate, lands in Dorset, and a substantial pension drawn from Cartwright shipping interests. Within months, she boarded a vessel back to England. Neither her husband nor any other member of her family accompanied her. She disappears from record shortly thereafter. Some suggest she remarried, others, that she entered a convent near Bath. What became of the photograph, the one that convinced a panel of solicitors to transfer a portion of an empire, remains unknown. No copy survives, no mention exists in probate inventories. Only the written description aligns with the Whitby Harbor image: the same boy, the same locket, the same unnerving composure. If this was indeed the same photograph, then its purpose becomes disturbingly clear. It was not a memento of grief but a document of fabrication, a proof of lineage designed to support a claim to wealth and title. The dead child's portrait was transformed into an instrument of inheritance. But several details complicate the story. For one, Sir Edmund Cartwright's legitimate daughter, Margaret, had been reported as having died in 1864 during a cholera outbreak in Portsmouth. Her death certificate, though faint and water-damaged, still exists in English archives. How, then, could she reappear nearly a decade later with perfect documentation? Forgery was not uncommon in Victorian society, especially among those desperate for status or security. Yet the consistency of Margaret's papers, and the photograph that supported them, suggests a level of sophistication beyond a simple deception. Historians like Eleanor Marsh, who later examined the case, argued that the Aldens may have been intermediaries rather than perpetrators. Perhaps they were hired to play roles, to construct a plausible family whose tragedy could be presented before the court. The missing child, real or staged, would serve as a symbol of legitimacy, his image the linchpin of the claim. If this theory is true, the implications are chilling. Somewhere between America's coastal villages and England's drawing rooms, a transaction took place, one in which a child's likeness, and perhaps his very body, became currency. In 1938, Marsh summarized her findings with cautious restraint. The photograph functioned not as art, nor as mourning, but as evidence. It bridged 2 continents and 2 falsehoods, one of blood and one of death. She might have added that it also bridged 2 eras, the fading world of superstition and the emerging world of bureaucracy. In that intersection, truth became negotiable, and the camera became its most convincing liar. The Cartwright affair, as later historians called it, faded quietly from public record after 1874. The estate dissolved over the following decades, absorbed into newer ventures, its family lines scattered. By the turn of the century, no one living could confirm who Margaret Alden truly was, or whether her child ever existed. All that remains is the photograph, the boy, the locket, the gaze that pierces through time with unnerving clarity. To the archivists who have studied it since, it feels less like a family relic than a confession pressed into paper, a silent witness to a fraud so elegantly composed that, for a moment, it passed as truth. And if the photograph indeed secured Margaret her inheritance, then it succeeded. The deception was complete. The dead boy of Whitby Harbor had purchased, with his stillness, a fortune for someone who may never have been his mother at all. The modern history of the Whitby Harbor photograph begins not with a collector or curator, but with a graduate student named Eleanor Marsh, who arrived in Providence in the autumn of 1934 to complete her doctoral thesis on American Death Portraiture and the Semiotics of Mourning. Marsh was 26, meticulous, and solitary by temperament. She favored the dim, dust-laden reading rooms of small historical societies, where the scent of nitrate paper and old varnish hung in the air. Her project, originally intended as a straightforward sociological study, shifted course the day she opened an unmarked wooden box in the archives of the Rhode Island Historical Society. Inside lay a disordered collection of glass negatives, a broken camera lens, and a leather-bound notebook bearing the name Jonathan Reed. Tucked among the plates was a faded photograph on thin paper, mounted on a card embossed with Reed's Providence address. It depicted a boy seated in a chair, one hand resting on his lap, the other grasping a locket. The boy's gaze, direct and unervingly calm, arrested Marsh at once. Her diary entry from that day survives. A child of about 7. Eyes open but unseeing. Background indistinct, as though the sea has withdrawn. There is something deliberate in the stillness, less a portrait than a message. At first, Marsh believed she had discovered a particularly fine example of post-mortem photography, a common but often misinterpreted Victorian custom. Yet the photograph's composition troubled her. The exposure was unusually long for the era, yet the image was crisp, free of motion blur. The boy's skin appeared unnaturally smooth, his eyes oddly reflective. When she compared the mounting card's watermark with others in the Reed collection, she noted a discrepancy. The typeface and paper stock dated from 1873, but the inked address listed a studio Reed had not occupied until the following year. Either the photograph had been reprinted later, or it was a deliberate reconstruction. Intrigued, Marsh requested access to Reed's surviving correspondence. Most were mundane, orders for chemicals, requests for payment, but one note stood out, a brief and signed letter postmarked from Whitby, Maine, dated June 1873. It contained only one sentence. The likeness is satisfactory. Payment enclosed. No amount of cross-referencing could identify the sender. But the place name, Whitby, sent Marsh on a trail that would consume the next 5 years of her life. She traced the Alden family through town ledgers, probate records, and ship manifests. Each clue deep in the mystery. There was indeed a Thomas Alden registered as a merchant in Whitby during the 1860s, and a wife, Margaret, but both vanished from records after 1872. The local church listed the burial of a child, male, Alden, the same year, but no age, no cause of death. By 1936, Marsh had gathered enough fragments to draft her first paper, The Image of the Child, a study in visual substitution. It was never published. Her advisor, Professor Wilmot, found her conclusions speculative to the point of heresy. She had argued that the Whitby photograph was not post-mortem at all, but a fabrication, a composite or staged image created to serve a legal or financial purpose. Rather than abandon her theory, Marsh doubled down. She corresponded with British archivists, combing through maritime inheritance cases from the 1870s. It was one of these letters, sent from a clerk in London's Chancery Archives, that finally connected the photograph to the Cartwright affair. The discovery electrified her. In a 1938 notebook, she wrote, "It is not merely a likeness, it is evidence." The photograph was a document in a legal claim, not an act of remembrance. The child's image was currency, purchased and spent. She located a partial transcript from the 1873 Cartwright proceedings that described a photograph matching the one in her possession. The description of the locket, the age of the child, even the faint maritime backdrop, all aligned. But her attempt to verify the connection met with resistance. The solicitor's firm that once handled the Cartwright estate refused access to its private archives, citing sensitivity of legacy. One letter, dated February 1939, was blunt. The matter to which you refer was settled in confidence. The photograph you describe, if it ever existed, forms no part of our retained documents. Shortly after receiving that letter, Marsh's tone in her journals shifted. Her entries became terse, almost anxious. She began to suspect that certain materials had been removed from the Rhode Island archives. In a note written that March, she recorded returning to the Reed collection only to find the original photograph missing. The box remains, but the plate is gone. Only the label remains, Harbor. Someone else has been here. Whether the photograph was stolen, misplaced, or intentionally destroyed has never been determined. Marsh spent the remainder of her career attempting to reconstruct its provenance from secondary evidence, copies, notes, and recollections of archivists who had glimpsed it before its disappearance. Her final monograph, The Invention of the Innocent Face, 1947, published posthumously, opens with a haunting line. A photograph may tell the truth, but not about the person it depicts. Eleanor Marsh died in 1946, leaving behind boxes of correspondence, marginalia, and a single surviving contact print of the Whitby Harbor image, grainy, ghosted, but unmistakable. Her handwriting across the back reads simply, "He never lived, yet he earned an inheritance." That fragment, preserved today in the university archives, marks the last known trace of both the photograph and the researcher who uncovered its secret. What began as an academic curiosity ended as an obsession. And yet, without Marsh, the story would have been lost entirely, the boy's image dissolving into obscurity, his counterfeit gaze never questioned. In that sense, the photograph achieved what its creators never intended. It survived, not as proof of lineage, but as proof of deception, uncovered by a woman who could not let the dead remain still. In 1952, 6 years after the death of Eleanor Marsh, a curator named Robert Hensley undertook the first organized inventory of the Jonathan Reed collection at the Rhode Island Historical Society. His task was routine: to catalog, restore, and rehouse the aging glass negatives that had begun to flake and collapse under decades of neglect. Hensley was not a historian by inclination. He had been trained as a chemist and came to archival work through the science of photographic preservation. Yet it was precisely this technical background that made his observations so valuable and so unsettling. Among the hundreds of plates bearing family portraits, landscapes, and sepia still lives, Hensley discovered a sequence of negatives numbered out of order. Their exposure numbers had been deliberately scratched out and replaced by a hand unfamiliar to Reed's. Each plate was faintly inscribed at the edge with a single word, Harbor. At first glance, they appeared to be partial exposures, blurred fragments of an interior space, perhaps a studio. But when Hensley examined them under magnification, he discerned the faint outline of a child's figure, seated. The features were indistinct, but one hand was clearly visible, holding what seemed to be a circular object, a locket. In his notes, dated October 19, 1952, Hensley wrote, "Plate damaged beyond recovery." However, chemical analysis indicates retouching with albumin and silver nitrate over original emulsion, suggesting the negative was altered post-development. This is not consistent with Reed's documented practice. He attempted to produce contact prints, but the emulsion resisted exposure. When light passed through the plate, it yielded not an image but a milky opacity, as though the photograph itself refused to re-emerge. Intrigued, Hensley compared the chemical residue on the Harbor plate with samples from Reed's other works. The results were anomalous. Reed's typical formula used a collodion base. The Harbor negative, however, contained traces of mercuric chloride, a substance occasionally employed by 19th-century photographers to erase or suppress details from an image. To a preservationist, such manipulation was tantamount to confession. Someone, perhaps Reed himself, had deliberately obscured the plate after developing it. Whether to hide the subject or protect himself from it, no one could say. Hensley prepared a technical report and filed it with the Society's archives. 2 months later, during a winter power outage, a small fire broke out in the photographic storage room. No lives were lost, but several dozen negatives were destroyed by smoke and water. Among them was the harbor plate. The official loss register lists it succinctly. Item 231, glass negative, damaged, unidentified child, destroyed December 30, 1952. Hensley's own account, written privately in his journal, is less tidy. The fire spared the shelves to the left and right, but not the box marked Harbor. Flames seemed to leap directly toward it. The lid had warped as though from within. When the embers cooled, the glass was intact, but blackened through, opaque like obsidian. No photograph remained. For years afterward, Hensley mentioned the incident only in technical correspondence. But in 1961, during a lecture at Brown University, he referred obliquely to a negative that undid itself. The phrase caught the attention of the Providence Herald, which published a brief human interest piece titled, "The Photograph That Wouldn't Print." The article reignited local interest in the Reed collection. Readers sent letters claiming to remember similar portraits, to have seen copies in attics or second-hand shops. None could be verified. The story took on the air of folklore, half truth, half haunting. In 1963, when Hensley retired, he donated his personal notebooks to the Society. Among them was a sealed envelope marked, "Private, do not open until after my death." It remained unopened until 1974, when the Society's director, Elizabeth Caro, found it in a file drawer. Inside were a few typewritten pages and a small contact print, dark, nearly illegible. Caro described it in her memo. Barely discernible image of a child, seated, eyes indistinct. Background fades into black. Faint outline of a medallion or locket at the hand. Light distortion across the center resembling double exposure. No chemical record identifies when or how the print was made. Some speculated that Hensley had managed a final exposure from the damaged plate before the fire. Others believed he recreated the image from memory. Whatever its origin, the print was catalogued under accession number RH74-019. It has since been stored in climate-controlled isolation, removed from public display due to material instability. Archivists who have handled it describe an inexplicable discoloration, an iridescent shimmer that appears briefly when the image is illuminated, then vanishes. The photograph has never been digitized. The Society's conservation policy prohibits it, citing concerns about chemical sensitivity to prolonged light exposure. But in private correspondence from 1975, Caro wrote to a colleague at Yale, "There is something about the child's eyes. When you move the print under the lamp, they catch light unevenly, as if some layer of the emulsion responds independently. I have seen deterioration. This is not that. It is as though the photograph remembers light." Today, the print remains sealed in archival storage, viewed only under supervision. The negative, of course, is gone. Its emulsion melted, its image burned into rumor. Yet through the notes of Marsh, Hensley, and Caro, the lost negative persists, not as evidence of the boy's existence, but of his erasure. In the end, it is that absence that defines the Whitby Harbor photograph, not what it shows, but what it withholds. A portrait that refuses to be seen. A record that unrecords itself. A proof that consumes its own evidence. And perhaps that is the truest photograph of all. In the spring of 1978, nearly a century after Jonathan Reed's death, the Rhode Island Historical Society began receiving an unusual pattern of inquiries. They were not from academics or journalists, but from private individuals, each asking, in subtly different language, to view the photograph of the boy from Whitby Harbor. The earliest letter, dated March 3rd, came from a woman in Maine who identified herself as Clara Whitmore. She claimed to be researching a maritime genealogy related to the Cartwright estate. The archivist on duty, Daniel Holt, replied politely that the Society possessed no publicly available photograph by that description. Whitmore never responded, but 1 week later, a man appeared at the archives in person, asking to see the negative destroyed in 1952. He presented no credentials, only a folded sheet of stationery embossed with the initials MC, and departed when told that the material was inaccessible. In the months that followed, more visitors came, quietly, sometimes after hours, often with precise knowledge of names and catalog numbers that had never been published. Their letters shared peculiar similarities, references to inheritance, provenance, and unfinished business. One correspondent even included a clipping of the Providence Herald's 1961 article, the headline circled in red pencil, "The photograph that wouldn't print." At first, Holt dismissed the attention as coincidence, perhaps sparked by renewed local interest in spiritualism and paranormal research. But the timing was curious. That same year, the Society's archives underwent reorganization, and the Reed collection was moved from its long-term storage vault to a temporary annex for cataloging. It was during that transition that Holt first encountered the print, the same contact copy discovered years earlier among Robert Hensley's papers. He described the experience in his 1979 field report. The image remains faint but intact. Under magnification, surface discoloration resembles oxidation, yet the effect shifts with angle of light. The boy's pupils seem reflective, producing the illusion of movement. Following archival protocol, Holt sealed the print again in its acid-free sleeve. Yet afterward, he noted something peculiar. When he returned to log the accession number, the corresponding line on his inventory sheet appeared to have been erased, not crossed out, but rubbed clean, leaving no trace of graphite. That summer, more letters arrived, 5 in total. One was postmarked from London, another from Halifax. All requested permission to view the surviving image. Each cited different reasons: artistic study, genealogical confirmation, private devotion. None referenced one another, yet all bore an identical postscript. It is necessary that the child be recognized. By autumn, the pattern had begun to unnerve the staff. Holt consulted with director Elizabeth Caro, who had overseen the collection since the 1970s. She admitted receiving similar requests years earlier but had chosen not to acknowledge them. Some letters, she recalled, had arrived without stamps, hand-delivered to the Society's locked door before dawn. Caro advised Holt to file all new correspondence under a separate heading, Unverified Inquiries, Reed, and to speak of them to no one. In her own later writings, Caro confessed that she came to regret that decision. For in October of 1978, 2 individuals appeared unannounced at the Society, a man and woman, elegantly dressed, identifying themselves only as representatives of the Cartwright Trust. They claimed to possess original documents proving that a portion of the Reed collection belonged by right to the family. When asked to produce identification, they declined, offering instead a notarized letter that Caro later described as impeccably forged. Before leaving, the woman reportedly paused before the locked case containing Hensley's contact print and said softly, "It isn't finished yet." Security logs confirmed that the pair left without incident. But that night, a motion sensor in the annex triggered twice, and the morning guard found the case door ajar. Nothing appeared stolen, yet the photograph's protective sleeve was found unsealed, the image slightly displaced. Caro ordered the print removed from display and transferred to cold storage. She made no public report, noting only in the internal memorandum, unauthorized access. No damage. Possible interest persists. The next week, an envelope arrived without a return address. Inside was a Polaroid photograph, grainy, underexposed, showing what appeared to be the archive's reading room. At the center of the frame sat an empty chair, lit by a shaft of sunlight. No people were visible. Written on the back in blue ink were 3 words. "He is waiting." No one ever claimed responsibility. The incident was never made public, and by early 1979, the trail of visitors ended as abruptly as it began. The letters ceased, the telephone calls stopped, and the archive returned to silence. But in her final recorded interview, conducted in 1982, Elizabeth Caro said something that has haunted archivists ever since. They weren't looking for the photograph. They were answering it.